Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is May the 11th, 2015, and we have a jam-packed show tonight. We're going to talk about a number of things involving Syria, the potential for direct and regional warfare in the Middle East, and two possibilities for the beginning of a world war in two different locations across the globe. We're also going to be talking about the ongoing military and domestic law enforcement joint drills that are taking place here in South Carolina this week, and we're going to talk about, hopefully, some more relevant issues to the color revolution apparatus that took place in Donetsk, and I'm sorry, not Donetsk, but Ukraine as a whole. We're going to talk about an update on Reverend Pinckney and the more reasons why not to stand with Rand. We're going to talk about that as well. There's a lot of stuff that we're going to try to get in this show, so let's jump right in. But before we do, I want to make sure that you are aware you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is when the new show is broadcast every week here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page you'll find the archive versions of this show, you'll find the links to my more recent articles, and you'll find the YouTube videos there as well. You can also go to UCY Chat if you're into the chat room, but that's been moved, so if anybody is wondering where that's at, it's been moved. And there's a link at the top of the UCY page that you can click on to find that if you're interested in it. Now, a small update on the scheduling of the show. Not only will be on Monday nights at 9 p.m., we are also on at 1 a.m. on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, at 9 p.m. on Friday night, and at, I believe, 5 p.m. on Saturday night, and again at 1 a.m. Sunday. Well, I guess that would be Monday morning, but you get the idea. So we're on 5 nights a week. 6 nights a week, actually. 6 nights a week, and you can catch us there at any opportunity. And of course, if you are unable to hit up the show at any time during the times that I've listed, that you can find the archives on my website, Brandon Turbeville. But the show is expanding as I told you it would early on. Now, if you're interested in my work in terms of my writing, then I would recommend that you go to activistpost.com and find my work there as it comes out. Also, naturalblaze.com. Occasionally I write for them. And but most importantly, brandonturbeville.com. That is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube videos, all of the archive versions of this show. All of the relevant information is there. The radio, the events, the books, it's all there at brandonturbeville.com. So please go check that out. Now, we need to get into the information that I brought up earlier. Now, we need to look at, let's do some background on the Syria situation if we can. Now, back in April, April 16th, we had the Syrian Easter celebration that people can go look at on the YouTube videos and see the areas in Syria that were taking part in that celebration. You can see, the clash of civilizations between the actual Syrians and the Western-backed death squad, should we say. But around this time, there were attacks taking place, there were rocket attacks that took place in government-held territory, which were the result of al-Nusra and ISIS terrorists, of course funded by the West, to overthrow Assad. They took place in government-held territory, and there were Syrian news reporters on the ground shortly after those attacks. They caught the footage of the victims being excavated from the rubble, and other civilians being treated for their wounds at the hospital. And sources inside Syria, and these are my sources, have described the missiles that hit the building, and this took place around Aleppo, as being much more advanced than the missiles that have been previously used by the terrorists. I mean, in other words, They described the building as being split in half after being hit by the missiles, and that's led a lot of people to believe that the terrorists in Aleppo have been provided with weaponry that's much more sophisticated and powerful than the weaponry they've had in the past. Now, when you look at footage that's been posted on the Syrian media of the building, the description that the building was split in half is very accurate. You can look at the video and you can see from the footage it appears to be an apartment building. It's been cut in half from the top to the bottom. Both sides are still standing. The left and the right side are still standing, but it looks like it's just had the center removed. Now, a lot of the residents interviewed by the Syrian media claimed that the death squads were targeting them for supporting the government, or at least not supporting the jihadists. The area where the missile struck had been under terrorist bombardment leading up to the incident and resulted in the death of a number of people, from anywhere from up to 17 or 17 up to 40 people, innocent civilians. Now, the intentional targeting of civilians on behalf of the death squads, the Western-backed death squads, was unreported in the Western media. But at the same time, there was another incident that was repeated quite a bit. On that Sunday, a school was destroyed in Aleppo, and that allegedly killed 5 children and 4 adults, and that was according to Reuters. The Assad al-Ansari school was located in the Al-Mashhad neighborhood, which is a terrorist-controlled area, and the Western press immediately jumped to the conclusion that the bombing was conducted by the Assad government. But we got to point out that the sole source for the report, suggesting that the school was bombed, is this discredited pro-death squad organization called the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is essentially one guy sitting around in the UK on the internet, Rami Abdel Rahman, who is the founder and director of the observatory. He has launched propaganda attacks alongside NATO and against the Syrian government since the beginning of the crisis, and he's admittedly bankrolled by a European country, although we don't know exactly what European country that is. That's been kept secret, but I think we got a pretty good idea. But for the reason alone that this report is coming from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that's enough to wonder whether or not the claims regarding the bombing of the school are entirely accurate to begin with. But we also got to point out that the schools in Syria had been closed for some time as a result of the Easter holiday, and that Sunday would have seen no children in attendance to begin with, so it's kind of a universal holiday. Even if the Assad government had bombed the building, the intention of slaughtering the children, as the Western press has attempted to report, was clearly not the case. But corporate media would have Americans believe that the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, deliberately targeted children for whatever reason, despite the fact that that would be extremely counterproductive to their cause in terms of domestic and international public relations. So the Syrian Observatory circulated a video where it claims it's proof of the attack. The video shows the aftermath of the bombing, with this man holding the severed leg of a child and rescue workers carrying away a body covered in a sheet. But you got to remember that the atrocities committed in Syria have long been blamed on Assad, only to be revealed later on that the war crimes were committed by the death squads. We have the chemical weapons attack, several chemical weapons attacks like the ones in Ghouta. We had the Hula massacre. There's been a concerted effort to portray Assad as the enemy and a ruthless butcher of civilians, but each and every one of those things have been proven to be the result of the death squad activity. So 5 years on, there's yet to be a shred of credible evidence to suggest that the Syrian army or the Assad government has intentionally targeted civilians ever. So with all that in mind, the propaganda regarding the school bombing by the Syrian army is most likely another attempt to gin up support for NATO action against the Syrian government, the way it was used when the Western press attempted to exploit an unintentional, at worst, bombing of a school building in May of last year. So we got to remember that these fabricated stories that just constantly get repeated in the mainstream media regarding Assad's alleged atrocities, only to find out later that it was the Western death squads who were responsible. we've got to keep that in mind. Okay, we got to observe these events from a logical standpoint. Always take whatever comes from NATO media outlets with a large grain of salt. And we've got to remember that it's the United States, it's Israel, it's NATO, it's the GCC who are ultimately responsible for this tragedy. And it's the leadership of these countries and these deep state pockets within this governmental, corporate, and banking structure that we have to hold responsible. So, got an article up on this. Media attacks Assad as terrorists attack civilians. So, go check that out. Now, we're getting to the more timely issue regarding Syria, but I want to point out a few other things. Now, it was evident early on that the U.S. bombing of alleged ISIS targets inside Syria was really an attempt to support the terrorist organization, not so much an attempt to defeat it. So, while people like Noam Chomsky has labeled the idea that the U.S. is actually supporting ISIS as a conspiracy theory, and it's been labeled a conspiracy theory by the mainstream media, these left gatekeepers and so forth, the fruits of America's labor in terms of the bombing campaign can't be ignored. So we also can't ignore the results of Saudi Arabia's bombing in Yemen. The truth is that the United States, NATO, and the GCC, as well as the Arab League, are bombing in couch support of ISIS, and they're increasing ISIS gains, they're increasing ISIS holds on power with every sortie that they fire. This fact is recognized because the NATO GCC network of national governments, we can now consider them the Air Force of Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda's Air Force, that's NATO and the GCC. So while we've got the government of Bashar al-Assad is the only force inside Syria actually fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these death squads were used by the Western propaganda machine to justify a bombing campaign that was actually directed at the Syrian military and Syrian infrastructure. Now, remember, we've talked about this here on this show, that this bombing campaign was launched against Syrian oil refineries, bridges, civilian neighborhoods, warehouses, agricultural centers, grain silos, etc. Other bombing campaigns were made against infrastructure that was set to be taken back by the Syrian military after a long-fought battle with the terrorists. And in Iraq, if you look at that, the U.S. bombing campaign has had much more to do with protecting Western-owned oil fields and death squad herding than eliminating ISIS. In fact, Iraqi armed forces and government officials have repeatedly revealed that the U.S. military has actually been supplying ISIS during the entire course of the bombing. So the Western mainstream press has attempted to paint the Iraqi claims of American assistance to ISIS as conspiracy theories, as they do everything else. And they're saying that it's jealousy. The Iraqi forces are upset that they can't defeat ISIS, that only the brave, strong, powerful Americans can do it. That same press has had to admit that the bombing campaign has resulted in a stronger ISIS presence in Iraq and Syria, and that the terrorist group has become stronger in terms of strategic location and military presence. Now, this was admitted, by the way, by the Daily Beast in January of this year. But, we've got, at least, here, I'll read the quote from the Daily Beast. It says, American jets are pounding Syria, but ISIS is taking key terrain and putting more and more people under its black banners. ISIS continues to gain substantial ground in Syria despite nearly 800 airstrikes in the American-led campaign to break its grip there. At least one-third of the country's territory is now under ISIS influence, with recent gains in rural areas that can serve as a conduit to major cities that the so-called Islamic State hopes to eventually claim as part of its caliphate. Meanwhile, the Islamic extremist group does not appear to have suffered any major ground losses since the strikes began. The result is a net ground gain for ISIS, according to information compiled by two groups with on-the-ground sources. In Syria, ISIS has not only lost any key terrain. Jennifer Caffarella, a fellow at the Washington, D.C. Institute for the Study of War, who studies the Syrian conflict, explained to the Daily Beast. Even U.S. military officials privately conceded to the Daily Beast that ISIS has gained ground in some areas, even as the Pentagon claimed it seized territory elsewhere largely around the northern city of Kobane, or Ain al-Arab as it should be delineated there. That's been the focus of the U.S.-led campaign, and ISIS has not been able to take the town despite its best efforts. Okay, end quote. Now, that report from the Daily Beast continued to point out that the ISIS gains were not only in terms of landmass, but in terms of control of people, meaning populated areas and strategic locations. So what it showed is that since the airstrikes, the ISIS territory has almost doubled in its control in Syria, but not only in terms of territory, but the number of people numerically who live under ISIS control has increased substantially. So, with Syrians who kind of lived in the government-held areas or areas that were contested now are finding themselves under ISIS control. The U.S. campaign began in August, and the Daily Beast is reporting that they say, little buds of ISIS control in eastern Homs, Al-Qalamun, which borders northern Lebanon, and southern Damascus that do appear to be growing because of that freedom of operation that could connect those western cells to key ISIS terrains in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor in northern and eastern Syria, end quote. So, the U.S. and NATO are acting as Al-Qaeda's air force in Iraq and Syria. I think that's been proven. I mean, ever since the airstrike started taking place, ISIS has done nothing but gain ground. So what does that tell you? If you look at Yemen, however, you can see that Saudi Arabia and the Arab League are playing the same role in Yemen. In addition to bombing the Houthi rebels to retain President Hadi in power and prevent the possibility of greater Iranian influence in the region, the Saudis are providing direct air support for extremists and Al-Qaeda jihadis who are on the ground in Yemen, who are themselves taking control of large swaths of territory, a la ISIS, just like ISIS is doing in Iraq and Syria with the U.S. bombing campaigns, then the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Yemen are doing the same thing under the Saudi bombing campaigns. So we have an interview with NPR by Leila Fadel, and she says, well, Al-Qaeda has been growing in Yemen for a while, but it seems to be accelerating in the midst of this bombing campaign, and Al-Qaeda is not a focus of the Saudi-led airstrikes right now. Okay, and then she goes on and she says, but critics say that actually Saudi's war is feeding Al-Qaeda. One Western diplomat says Al-Qaeda is actually growing like a weed right now, and a spokesman for Al-Qaeda inside Yemen says they're really happy with the airstrikes because it's weakening their enemies, who are the Houthis and the Yemeni army, end quote. So in other words, the Saudi airstrikes are enabling Al-Qaeda's influence and territorial gains to spread across the country. So this shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody who consider themselves an informed observer, because Saudi Arabia has long been recognized as the largest supporter of terror worldwide, and it's only attempting to slightly veil its support for terrorist organizations like ISIS or Al-Qaeda and Chechen rebels. Slightly veil its support. So that support for terror and terrorism comes with the obvious blessing of the United States and Israel and NATO, since that terror is directed at target countries abroad and a dissatisfied and compliant target population here at home. So the fact is that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other related terrorist organizations function as the CIA's Arab Legion, and the NATO GCC Arab League are functioning as ISIS and Al-Qaeda's Air Force. So if you want to read more about that, I've got an article up there about that too, Al-Qaeda's Air Force, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. So please check that out. Now, getting to the important news here in a minute, but we got to look at also the question of Idlib, right? The volley of mainstream press yapping about the fall of Idlib to Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces recently, this really reveals more of the NATO plan as it does provide news to begin with, because what it reveals is that there's a simultaneous participation of a media campaign designed to weaken the morale of the Syrian people and present a sense of inevitability amongst the Syrian people and amongst the populations following the crisis here at home and in the Western world. So it's mind war. The media hysteria has been the norm in the West in regards to Syria, but in terms of the recent media blitz over Idlib, the goal, which has been part of this NATO-Turkish plan since early on in the conflict, was to enable the capture of a major Syrian city so they could provide a physical seat of what would then be presented as a government in exile, or the interim government, or the transitional government. So while this interim government would be painted as a modern-day grouping of founding fathers and freedom lovers that are, bravely standing up to a dictator, the reality would actually be that this interim government would just be a gaggle of terrorists and jihadists bent on imposing Sharia law and then just bathing in bathtubs full of Western money. So this only a matter of a day or a couple of days after the death squads took over Idlib, the death squads who could barely govern their interactions with one another anywhere else in the country, announced that they were well on their way to establishing what they referred to as a civilian government in Idlib. And we had the report by the Wall Street Journal. Syrian opposition tries to govern newly won Idlib city. Let's read this briefly. It says, the rebel groups that took over a provincial capital in northwest Syria over the weekend are now trying to consolidate control and establish civil governance. After days spent tearing down the ubiquitous images of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the coalition of Islamist groups, which includes Al-Qaeda's Nusra Front, say they will help form a civilian government to run Idlib, capital of Idlib province. For now, the streets are full of armed fighters with little organizational direction. It continues, it says, the opposition has a lot to prove in terms of governance, as much of the territory it controls is beset by crime, corruption, and lack of services, in addition to regular attacks by the Syrian regime. The political opposition in exile, the Syrian National Coalition, has provided funding for local councils, but the money has often been scarce and unreliable, end quote. So, just to point out, notice how the Wall Street Journal refers to the opposition to Al-Qaeda, to Al-Nusra Front, and rebels accurately for a change, because they're referring to them as the same entity. So they're admitting that Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and what they call the opposition and the rebels are all the same organization. So good job getting it right for a change, Wall Street Journal. Now, we've got, obviously I always recommend Tony Cartolucci of Land Destroyer Report, New Eastern Outlook, who's very good at this, at covering this situation. But the Turkish media has seized upon that jihadist victory this is coming from his report, but it's seized on the jihadist victory and began calling for Idlib to be used as the capital for the interim government. This is just as we reported earlier. But the interim government would be presented as the legitimate government of Syria that would have been given a physical seat of power after Bashar al-Assad was taken out. So there's little doubt that an interim government like this would not only consist of jihadists and the subsequent imposition of Sharia law, but also the parasites and traitors that make up the Syrian National Coalition, that group of pathetic individuals who just lap up the luxury of five-star hotels paid for by the Saudi and American money, in other words, the American taxpayer. But the forming of an interim, albeit illegitimate government, would follow the model of Libya, the NATO conquest that has preceded Syria. Although the Syrian conquest has not been completed yet, But the goal of developing an interim government located inside Syria and protected by NATO bombing campaigns by virtue of the establishment of a buffer zone or a no-fly zone, which we've talked about here on numerous occasions, that's been one that the NATO and GCC groups have drooled over for quite some time. So early on, it appeared that Aleppo was the preferred target for NATO to establish this transitional government, but that was ultimately defeated by the Syrian army, and the Syrian army control over Aleppo has been gaining in recent months. They've cut off supply routes from Turkey, for instance, and they've essentially surrounded the city, so that's only a matter of time. Damascus was seen to have been a target for no other reason than it's the capital of Syria, but those attempts didn't really work either. So Idlib has been another story because the jihadists have been able to sweep in and take control of the territories, and they were able to do so in a manner that was so swift that it was confusing to many people who were unfamiliar with the details of the crisis. But the reason they were able to do that is because the Idlib lies only a few miles away from the Turkish borders. This is where these monkeys were coming in from. Now, the location of Idlib in relation to Turkey is important because it's from Turkey that we get the steady supply of weapons and fighters that are entering Syria. So it's no coincidence that the presence of Jabal al-Nusra is strongest in the areas bordering Turkey, as well as those bordering Jordan, and is another supporter of these death squad forces. So while the Western press is busy representing Assad as having lost control of the overwhelming majority of the country, and they're providing maps in the mainstream press that are they're inconsistent with the realities on the ground, to say the least, the truth is that the Syrian forces are on their way to returning Idlib to government control. But they're attempting to do that in a way that minimizes the loss of civilian life. They're doing it in a surgical fashion. The Syrian army is already in control of the southern portion of Idlib. It's only a matter of time before the military is able to retake the city as a whole, providing there aren't any more mass injections of jihadists into the fray. But we got to remember that the U.S. airstrikes and their attempts to create this buffer zone inside Syria they're a farce, but they're a plan that's real enough. So the death squads that are running amok in Syria right now are entirely creatures of NATO. You got to remember that they're entirely under NATO's command. The true enemy of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and the cannibals of the Levant have always been and continues to be the government of Assad. There will be no interim government or transitional phase that will ever be legitimate in the context of NATO, in the context of this NATO and Anglo-American assault on Syria. So go take a look at my article, NATO Attempted Interim Government in Syria Echoes Libya Model. That's up at BrandonTurbeville.com as well. Now we got to get into the more, pressing news, because there are reports that have filtered in that there are now preparations taking place for a direct military assault on Syria being made by Turkey in concert with the Saudis and Qataris. Okay, so these reports are suggesting that the military offensive, a direct military offensive, the military forces of the Saudis, of the Turks, and the Qataris proper, their military forces are preparing to invade Syria, and that the reports are suggesting that this will take place within the next few days. So there's been other sources that have pointed out that they think this action is going to take place further down the road in late June, but others have said in the next few days. So the reports are that Turkish forces are gathering at their southern border, and that which is Syria's northern border, in a fashion that signifies the posturing for military action. Now, let me be clear. I am not predicting I'm not predicting military action to happen. I'm not predicting dates. I'm not giving you dates. I'm not hinting that these attacks will definitively take place at all. I'm just saying that the stage has already been set for some time for this to it's been set to cause us to contemplate the possibility of this type of attack. So I'm not throwing down my cards here. I'm not hitching myself to any wagons, but I am reporting what I'm hearing from certain sources in the Middle East. So these last few weeks, we've seen geopolitical alliances and talks have begun. They've been coalescing. So they indicate that an attack is not only possible but probable in the near future. That is true. And, of course, we know the U.S. and NATO have attempted to gin up support for a direct assault on Syria since early on in the crisis, when it became apparent that proxy armies of terrorists and lunatic apes alone weren't going to accomplish regime change. So the plans, at least from the Turk side of the fence, appear to be twofold. It seems that the plan to attack Syria has been part of the NATO agenda from the moment the death squads were routed by Assad's forces, and Turkey has always been a major player in this regard. Of course, we know that's the case. But also the domestic Turkish situation. Remember, Prime Minister Recep Erdogan, his own governing party has been suffering a number of scandals, criticisms, and failures over the last several months. And it's like the same case in every country. A foreign war is more helpful in diverting the attention of the local population away from domestic concerns than anything else. So it's not the cause. The domestic concerns are not necessarily the cause, but the cause is the NATO plan to destroy Syria. But it's certainly plunging support from the Turkish public is a stick used to prod Erdogan into further action. It's the sort of the cattle prod. So in terms of the Saudis, they seem to be emboldened by their illegal war in Yemen and their ability to massacre civilians abroad with little repercussions from the international community. The Saudis apparently feel more capable of acting against Syria directly and especially in concert with the Turks and the Qataris. These attacks on Syria would take place much like the Yemeni strikes, and this is, undoubtedly they'll take place with U.S. backing and support, leading from behind. The plan to attack Syria, these plans that we're talking about now, were allegedly drawn up in Ankara, in Turkey, in collusion with the Qataris, and who also maintain interest in the region because of that Iranian pipeline that was scheduled to move through Syria that would have cut off a lot of the interest of the Qataris. Now, the idea was is to establish a solid foothold in the north of Syria. The Aleppo offensive, the Aleppo offensive, the proxy terrorist has really been grounded to a halt with the Syrian army's encirclement of the city. So they have cut supply lines from southern Turkey going into Aleppo. So the attack on Idlib was accomplished using this 3-truck suicide barrage. This is according to Syrian security forces. On the part of the death squad, they used the 3-truck suicide barrage, and they had a breach in the defenses. I'm sorry if this is confusing. I'm trying to not be as unclear as this may sound, but there was a breach in the defenses of the National Defense Forces. There was apparently some treason taking place in there. Which all of this was followed up by the takeover of Jisr al-Shugur, which is the place in Idlib. But they have not been able to cut supplies for government forces, and there was apparently, in order for this offensive on Idlib, they removed a lot of terrorists from other portions of the country. So Latakia saw an outflux of terrorists going into Idlib, and now they're there, and the Syrian military is trying to encircle them and go in and cut them out as well. So basically what I'm saying is that the attempt by the Turks to establish a solid foothold in the north of Syria has, through proxy forces, failed. So what they're doing is they're falling back on the possibility of direct military invasion to sort of create a buffer zone or a safe zone, but an invasion that removes the Syrian military from the north side of Syria, allows the death squads to take complete control of all of this territory, and then declare it a safe zone. So we've got Iran sanctions set to expire after June 2015, and you'd have a new, an energized Tehran would be the last thing that Turkey wants, the last thing that Saudi Arabia wants. They would, Iran would be flush with new wealth. Iran would easily be able to support the economy of Syria and and support the Syrian military. So the plan from the Turks and the Saudis is also an attack on Damascus taking place from the Kalamun, Quneitra, possibly from Deira in the south. The idea would be to overwhelm the Syrian forces by utilizing the Saudi Arabian air power. In the northern part of the country, the Turks want to use their air force to assist the Al-Qaeda fighters. Syrian missiles are planned to be kept at bay by the Patriot missile systems provided by NATO countries, and that is the military plan on the part of the Turks. And again, as I said, other sources have suggested to me that this direct military campaign against Syria might begin a bit further off at the end of June. They have cited cryptic statements by death squad fighters and death squad supporters that the battle in Syria will be hot until June 30th. So we can only speculate when this direct assault on Syria will take place. But there has clearly been posturing from Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It becomes more threatening. NATO is certainly playing a big role in this as well. So it's something to watch. And again, I'm not making any predictions here. I want to be clear. I'm not hitching myself to the wagon that this is going to happen. Now we need to talk about these Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatari agreements. It was reported by the Huffington Post on April 12th that the Turks and Saudis were in high-level talks regarding an agreement to form a military alliance to remove Assad from power. The talks were mitigated by Qatar, and they've been known about for quite some time. In fact, they've been taking place since February of this year. It was only reported by the Huffington Post in April. The meetings were finally made public to the Western audiences by the mainstream media a few months later, and Obama chimed in. This is what Obama had to say. He says, "We both," he means himself and the Emir of Qatar, "are deeply concerned about the situation in Syria. We'll continue to support the moderate opposition there and continue to believe that it will not be possible to fully stabilize that country until Mr. Assad, who has lost legitimacy in the country, is transitioned out. How we get there, obviously, is a source of extraordinary challenge, and we shared ideas in terms of how that can be accomplished." End quote. Yawn. All right, so these sources cited by the Huffington Post suggested that if the Turkey-Saudi Arabia talks went well, that the two countries would be able to move forward with their plans regardless of American support, military support, or political support. So this is what the Huffington Post writers have to say. They say the Turks generally support the removal of Assad, but have said that as a non-Arab nation they are unwilling to take a greater role in Syria without expanded intervention by Saudi Arabia, a Sunni Arab power. Turkey's leadership has criticized the U.S.-led coalition striking Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria for its refusal to also go after the Syrian regime. Saudi Arabia recently demonstrated its willingness to intervene militarily in the region by leading a coalition of Arab nations and launching airstrikes against the Shia Houthi rebels in Yemen. While the U.S. did not participate directly, American officials said the U.S. provided logistical and intelligence support to the mission. There have been previous indications that Turkey and Saudi Arabia were discussing a cooperative effort in Syria. On March 2nd, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Saudi Arabia's King Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud Salman met in Saudi capital of Riyadh, where they announced an agreement to jointly boost aid to Syrian opposition and broaden overall cooperation on defense and security matters. The latest news of high-level talks, however, is the first indication of direct military participation against Assad by either country. Now, end quote. Turkey and Saudi Arabia have traditionally found themselves at odds, I guess we should say. They're able to work with their NATO allies. So this has sort of been the common denominator between the two. But they have shown a tendency to work closer and more openly together. And we'll read more from the Huffington Post here. Let's see, the Huffington Post, Grimm, Jones, and Schulberg. Yeah, here we go. This is what they have to say. They say, weeks after he met with the Saudi king, the Turkish leader signed a defense deal with Qatar to facilitate intelligence sharing, military cooperation, and possible deployment of Turkish and Qatari troops in one another's countries. This agreement builds upon a joint training deal the two countries signed in 2012 and positions Qatar well to mediate the discussions between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Okay. Osman Tani Koruturk, the main representative of the leading Turkish opposition Republican People's Party on Turkey's Foreign Affairs Committee, is concerned that the Turkish ground troops could soon be in Syria. Again, he's concerned that Turkish ground troops could soon be in Syria. He and other opposition members on the committee expressed this concern during official talks over the deal and later in a press conference after it was signed by the committee on March 2nd, according to documents obtained by the World Post. The deal was then sent to the parliament and Erdogan to be signed. So, end quote. But at the very least, there's been a clear intensification of death squad activity in northern Syria and the areas bordering Turkey. This is obviously because of Turkish assistance, because they're training, arming, funneling jihadists into Syria through borders. It's also because of the recent strengthening of the alliance between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. It's resulted in even further alliances between the two interlopers, proxy forces that often fought separately from one another due to these minor differences in religious ideology at the bottom level. Is this sort of Muslim Brotherhood, full-on Wahhabi fanatic. They're all fanatics, but there was a limit to the ability to work together, believe it or not. So the Andrew Korybko, who I did an interview with on Russian radio, he actually points out, he says, the only reason that these differing terrorist groups cooperate and don't behead one another is because their external patrons are now on the same page in pursuing regime change first and settling intra-jihadist scores second. Yep, exactly. So, that's end quote. The plans to invade Syria directly are no doubt known by the Syrian government. In fact, I know they're known by the Syrian government. It was an issue that was addressed by permanent Syrian representative to the UN, Bashar al-Jafari. He stated on May 4th that, quote, any serious attempt to occupy Aleppo will be met with open war with the party that it would resort to, whether Turkey or any other. So that's a pretty clear statement from Jafari. Now, lastly, we got to look at the Iranian element. We're going to talk about the military drills coming up, so don't go away. But the Iranian element, one possible motive for the intensification of proxy forces and possible direct military attacks in ground troops is the possibility of the removal of sanctions on Iran, placed upon Iran by the imperialist and U.S. and Western countries. The odds that any attempt at the removal of sanctions or on Iran or peace with Iran will fail due to lack of sincerity on the part of the Anglo-Americans, I think are pretty high. I don't personally see that the removal of sanctions or peace will last very much longer. But if sanctions are removed, Iran will become an even bigger regional player, particularly in regards to Syria. Now, let me read another quote from Huffington Post. It says, it's an alliance that's being forced by the perceived success of the Iranians, said Faraz Abi Ali, a Middle East senior manager at the risk analysis firm IHS, referring to the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Turkey on the issue of Syria. Ali added that without international sanctions, Iran would likely be doing even more to help Assad. Iran has been engaged in Syria with one hand tied behind its back as a result of the sanctions, he said. Without that constraint, the perception among the Sunni states, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, would be that they need to contribute significantly more to match what they fear will be an increased Iranian commitment, end quote. So, as I mentioned earlier, Ziad Fadel of Syrian perspective, he pointed out that the Iranian sanctions are set to expire in June 2015, and that this new and energized Tehran would be the last thing the Turks and Saudis want to see. It was pretty funny. He says he's quote, "Flush with new wealth, Iran could more easily buttress the economy of Syria as the SAA continues to sweep away the syphilis-carrying rats who keep mouthing that nihilistic and meaningless Allahu Akbar." He writes. So that's Ziad over at Syrian Perspective. You should go check out his website as well. But all that aside, you can't make any mistake that the Western press attempts to present the actions of Saudi Arabia and Turkey as independent and centered around their own interests. It's not the Turks and the Saudis at the center of this. It's the alliance with the alliances and any military actions that take place are going to be part of NATO sponsored and directed plans to destroy Syria and Iran later on, and then on to Russia and China. It's been pointed out, the only country that could possibly bring together Israel, Egypt, and Turkey in all these wars is the United States. And Saudi Arabia and Turkey, their moves in the Middle East, at least in regards to this larger geopolitical spectrum, are not independent. It would be safe to say that both countries, along with Qatar, have played the role of the U.S. and NATO puppets for some time. So what could we see if there is direct military invasion in Syria? What would war look like? Well, much like the ensuing provocations that are taking place in Ukraine and directly against Russia, the provocations in the Middle East can have wide-reaching effects, not just regionally but worldwide. If you see a Saudi-Turk strike against Syria, that could do a number of things. That could either accomplish its goal, which is end the resistance put up by Bashar al-Assad, turn the country into Libya 2.0, or it could backfire and result in, the downing of large quantities of invading jets, the potential destruction of Turkish infrastructure, the ability of the Syrians to launch missiles into the Turkish territory, blow up some dams, blow up some power stations, that sort of thing. It was certainly going to cost a lot of Syrian lives. It's probably going to cost Turkish lives. You could also draw in regional powers like Iran or Israel. Iran could come to the defense of Syria. The Israelis, always provoking and violating international law and violating human rights, would most likely be involved in some type of attack. And this could bring in the U.S. and Russia. If it doesn't go to the way of the GCC and NATO, then the U.S. is likely to be involved as well, and that could bring in Russian proxy forces or Russian military forces. You can only really speculate as to what will happen in the future, but this is not good, to say the least. This has potentially devastating effects. So it's another reason to make sure that the pro-war crowd doesn't get a voice in domestic affairs. Sorry, guys, but the millions of dead people and possibly World War III is not worth your ability to make giant profits, to position yourself geopolitically, or for the lower levels of you who are overcome with such blind hatred because of the propaganda, because you're following fake news sites or going to Fox News or listening to the warmongers, or because you're the humanitarian bombers of the left, then sorry, you guys don't get a voice here. So it needs to stop, and people need to start speaking out against this type of situation. So let's move on quickly. I should have probably mentioned the more breaking news at the beginning of the show, so we will keep that in mind for future broadcasts. But we have reports that have just come in of military and domestic law enforcement engaging in joint drills in Richland County, South Carolina. So this is only a year after the Richland County Sheriff's Department and the U.S. military raised eyebrows in South Carolina regarding these similar types of drills. The Sheriff's Department there has again announced that the department will be conducting drills that involve the joint training of civilian law enforcement and the U.S. military. It was reported on May 8th when the training began, of course, not ahead of time, but it's reported by WLTX in Columbia that the Richland County Sheriff's Department is going to be conducting drills in conjunction with the 3rd Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, or out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And these exercises are supposed to take place at late night and pre-dawn, and they're going to run from May 8th until May 15th. So they have informed citizens in the area that the Sheriff's Department and military vehicles are going to be traveling on the lower Richland County community near Eastover and Hopkins, as well as Elgin near Screaming Eagle Road. The vehicles are going to be traveling in the North Richland County area near Monticello Road. And the Sheriff's Department has announced that the residents in the area might hear explosives being detonated, they might hear ordnance being set off, and they might hear shots being fired. The Sheriff, Leon Lott, has stated that the department's special response team is going to be working with the 3rd Special Forces Group in this training. Now, the special response team is this type of SWAT-like team formulation that's becoming very popular in the South Carolina Sheriff's Departments in small towns all across the state. It's not SWAT, but it's like SWAT. For instance, some Sheriff's Departments have old ambulances reconverted to be bulletproof, to carry, essentially act as a poor man's ATV, not an ATV, but a poor man's MRAP. So it's not technically SWAT, but it's like SWAT. And so this is going to be taking part in the exercise as well. So the Sheriff, Leon Lott, he announced that the Sheriff's Department will, quote, provide simulated scenarios for the military, and added that the Richland County area is an ideal location for training that cannot be replicated at Fort Bragg. All right, they didn't really elaborate as to what these scenarios might be or what the training will involve. This might be because the last time the Richland County Sheriff's Office conducted training with Special Forces, it was simulating and training to raid farmhouses and engage in domestic raids, as well as setting up checkpoints and engaging in chopper insertion. You can go look at my article, Local Police Train with Special Forces to Raid Farmhouses, Conduct Domestic Raids, and you'll see the details on that, what happened. This is almost a year to the day the drills are taking place. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not a year to the day, but it's almost a year ago. But it's taking place in the exact same location as last year's drills. So are we supposed to assume that the drills are going to be the same thing about going in and taking out farmers out of their homes and assuming killing them? But at this point, we can only speculate as to what the drills are. I don't have any intelligence or sources so far telling me what these drills are like, what they are actually doing. So the increase in the amount of drills that are taking place recently, we know that over the last 25 to 30 years, there's been a uptick in military drills and law enforcement drills and joint military law enforcement drills that involve the forced removal of American citizens, the arrest of American citizens, the killing of American citizens, the martial law crackdowns, relocations, all that kind of stuff, disarming, all that stuff. We know that these drills have been seeing an uptick in recent years. But in the last few years, they've been almost becoming commonplace. And in the last year or so, they have been almost ongoing somewhere in the country all throughout the year. And again, we've Jade Helm exercises that a lot of people have talked about. That's been going on for quite some time, and it's continuing to go on. And now these drills in Columbia, South Carolina, or Richland County are taking place as well in the midst of Jade Helm. And this is now the second major military and law enforcement, or military and civilian drill that's taken place this year, just in South Carolina. So we've got to bear this in mind. This is happening for a number of reasons. Of course, this is to acclimate American citizens to the fact that the military will be on the streets, and it's also to train the military and the police to work together. in these type of martial law scenarios, and it's to train the military that you are an occupying force in America. They're to train them that the American people are the enemies. And don't you think for one second that your precious boys in uniform won't open fire on you just because you've got a Semper Fi sticker on your car, or you've got a disabled veteran ball cap on. Sorry guys, your boys in uniform will fire on you as soon as they're told to. Don't believe it? They did it in Katrina. So I don't want to hear about, oh, the military won't fire on their own people. That's bullshit. They already have. They've already stated that they're willing to do that, and of course they will. They can fire on people overseas, they'll fire on people here. We're forgetting a little something called the Civil War, when American citizens fired on American citizens and on a day-to-day basis. So it's possible, and it's probable that it's eventually going to be coming here. So it's something to bear in mind, shall we say, for the future. So we're running out of time here. I wish I could get to more stuff about the domestic issues. We'll cover the rest of this. There's a lot more stuff to cover, and we will. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
We're announcing today that combat training has begun for a company-sized group from the new Syrian forces. This program is critical and a complex part of our counter-ISIL efforts. We expect a second group to begin training in the next few weeks. Of course, we would have some responsibility to protect forces. Now, remember, their mission is to fight ISIL. So that's the combat we expect them to get involved in. We do expect to support them in that regard. If they are contested by regime forces, we would have some responsibility to help them. We have not decided yet in detail how we would exercise that responsibility, but we have acknowledged that we have that responsibility.
I do think that the regime's momentum has been slowed, and therefore you can certainly, from that, take that I do believe the situation is trending less favorably for the regime. And if I were him, I'd find the opportunity to look to the negotiating table.
Syria's government is accused this morning of another chemical warfare attack on its own people. Activists in Idlib province say helicopters dropped at least 2 bombs filled with chlorine. One group claims 12 people suffocated. So far, the reports are unconfirmed. Syria handed over a stash of chemical weapons 2 years ago, but chlorine was not included.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.